The banquet hall glittered with excess, chandeliers casting golden light across tables draped in silk, each centerpiece a cascade of roses and lilies that must have cost more than most people's rent. Balloons bobbed in perfect clusters, their metallic sheen catching the glow, and a five-tiered cake stood at the room's heart, its icing sculpted into delicate swirls, topped with a crystal tiara that shimmered like a promise. The air smelled of sugar and wealth, but it was too quiet for a birthday party. At the center of it all sat Leela Monroe, 18 years old today, her wheelchair positioned beside the cake, her chin lifted as if daring the emptiness to swallow her. Her eyes, sharp and green, scanned the room, but no one met her gaze. The guests were executives in tailored suits, socialites in glittering gowns are clustered in corners, their laughter muted, their glances sliding past her like she was a ghost. Her father, Richard Monroe, CEO of Monroe Enterprises, stood near the bar, his phone pressed to his ear, barking orders about a merger that couldn't wait. Leela's hands rested in her lap, fingers twisting the hem of her emerald dress, the one she'd picked because it matched her eyes, the one she'd hoped might make someone notice her tonight. She'd known it would be like this. Her father's world was one of power plays and polished surfaces, where people showed up for the optics, not the heart. Still, she'd let herself hope. 18 was a milestone. Wasn't it? A day when someone might see her, not the chair, not the accident that had taken her legs at 12, not the daughter of a man too busy to look up from his empire. She'd imagined music, laughter, maybe even a dancier, someone lifting her chair, spinning her under the lights. But the band played softly in the corner, a string quartet her father had hired for prestige, and the dance floor stayed empty. The cake loomed beside her, untouched, its perfection mocking her solitude. She could feel the weight of every absent glance, every whispered conversation that wasn't about her. Her chest tightened, but she wouldn't cry. Not here. Not where they could see. Across the room, her father's voice carried, sharp and impatient. No, we close the deal tonight. I don't care about the time difference. Leela's lips pressed into a thin line. He hadn't even wished her happy birthday yet, not properly. A card with his assistant's handwriting and a diamond bracelet delivered by courier didn't count. She glanced at the bracelet on her wrist, its stones cold against her skin, and wondered if he'd even picked it out himself. Probably not. Richard Monroe didn't do details. He built skyscrapers, not connections. The guests drifted, their voices a low hum, discussing stock prices, vacations in the Maldives, anything but the girl in the wheelchair. Leela's fingers tightened on the fabric of her dress, the silk crumpling under her grip. She told herself she didn't care, that she was used to it, but the sting was sharper today. She was 18, and no one had even approached the cake. No one had sung. No one had asked her how she was. She stared at the candles, unlit, their wicks pristine, and felt the room grow smaller, the walls closing in. She could wheel herself out, disappear to her room upstairs, but that felt like surrender. She wasn't invisible. Not yet. Then, a small voice broke the haze. Wow, that cake's huge. Leela's head turned, her eyes catching on a boy, maybe 6 or 7, standing a few feet away. His hair was a mess of dark curls, his suit slightly too big, the sleeves slipping over his hands. He was staring at the cake, eyes wide, like it was a mountain he wanted to climb. Behind him stood a man tall, broad-shouldered, his tie loosened, his jacket slung over one arm. His face was kind but tired, lines etched around his eyes, the kind that came from sleepless nights and too many responsibilities. He held a small gift bag, its tissue paper crinkled, and his other hand rested lightly on the boy's shoulder. Sorry, the man said, his voice low but warm. He's got a thing for cake. He smiled, and it was real, not the polished grin of the other guests. Leela blinked, caught off guard. No one else had spoken to her all night, not directly. She glanced at the boy, who was still eyeing the cake like it held the secrets of the universe. It's okay, she said, her voice softer than she meant it to be. It's kind of a lot, isn't it? She gestured to the cake, her fingers loosening their grip on her dress. The boy nodded vigorously, stepping closer, his sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. "Can you eat all that?" he asked, his tone serious, like he was calculating the logistics. Leela laughed, a sound that surprised her, light and unguarded. It felt like the first real thing she'd done all night. "I don't know," she said, leaning forward slightly. "It's pretty big. I might need help." The boy's eyes lit up, but before he could respond, the man stepped forward, his hand still on the boy's shoulder. "We're crashing, aren't we?" he said, his smile apologetic but not embarrassed. "I'm Ethan. This is Max. We're a broken bar not exactly on the guest list, but your dad's assistant said it was okay if we dropped by. I work with one of his suppliers. Small contract, nothing fancy." He shrugged, like he was used to being the least important person in a room. Max insisted on bringing a gift, though. Max held up the gift bag, its tissue paper fluttering. "It's a good one," he said proudly. Leela's chest warmed, a feeling she wasn't used to, not here in her father's world of cold ambition. She reached for the bag, her fingers brushing the crumpled paper. "Thank you, Max," she said, her voice steady now. She looked at Ethan, who was watching her with a quiet intensity, like he was trying to figure out why she was alone. "You're not crashing," she added. "It's a broken bar kind of empty anyway." Her eyes flicked to the crowd, then back to him, and for a moment, they shared a look that said they both understood what it meant to be on the outside. Ethan glanced at the empty chairs around the cake, then at Max, who was practically vibrating with excitement. "Well," he said, his voice gentle but deliberate, "mind if we join you? Max here's been talking about cake since we walked in, and I don't think he'll forgive me if we leave without trying it." Leela's breath caught. It was such a small question, but it felt enormous, like a lifeline tossed across a chasm. She nodded, her lips curving into a smile she hadn't planned. "Yeah," she said. "I'd like that." Ethan pulled out a chair for Max, who scrambled up, his eyes never leaving the cake. Leela wheeled herself closer to the table, her hands steady now, the weight in her chest lifting just a little. Ethan sat across from her, his jacket draped over the back of his chair, and for the first time all night, the room didn't feel so empty. Max started asking questions. Did she pick the cake? Did she like chocolate or vanilla better? Was it true she lived in a mansion? And Leela answered, her voice growing stronger with each word. Ethan listened, chiming in with a quiet joke or a nudge to keep Max from talking over her, and soon, the three of them were laughing, the sound cutting through the sterile hum of the party. Leela glanced at the gift bag, still unopened in her lap, and felt a pang of curiosity. She reached inside, pulling out a small, hand-painted bookmark, its edges decorated with tiny flowers and stars. "I made it," Max said, his chest puffing out. "Dad helped, but I did the colors." "It's beautiful," Leela said, and she meant it. She traced the uneven lines, the smudges where Max's small hands had pressed too hard, and felt something shift inside her. This wasn't a gift bought to impress, it was real, made with care. She looked at Ethan, who was watching Max with a mix of pride and exhaustion, and wondered what his life was like outside this room. A single dad, he'd said. No ring on his finger, no mention of anyone else. Just him and Max, showing up to a party where they didn't belong. For her, the band shifted to a livelier song, and Max's head whipped around. "Can we dance?" he asked, already half out of his chair. Leela froze, her hands tightening on the arms of her wheelchair. Dancing wasn't something she did, not anymore. But before she could say anything, Ethan leaned forward, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Max, you know what's cooler than dancing?" he said, spinning. He looked at Leela, his eyes asking permission. "If you're up for it, I bet we could give this dance floor a show." Leela's heart pounded, but not with fear. It was something else, the excitement, maybe, or the thrill of being seen. She nodded, and Ethan stood, moving behind her chair. Max grabbed her hand, his small fingers warm against hers, and together, they moved to the center of the floor. Ethan pushed her chair in gentle circles, then faster, letting it spin just enough to make Max giggle and Leela laugh, her hair flying, her dress catching the light. The guests turned, their conversations faltering, and for once, Leela didn't care about their stares. She was here, alive, spinning under the chandeliers with a boy who thought her cake was a mountain and a man who'd asked to join her. When the song ended, they returned to the cake, breathless and grinning. Ethan lit the candle as someone had finally found a lighter, and Max led a loud, off-key rendition of Happy Birthday that made the whole room turn. A few guests joined in, hesitant at first, then louder, and Leela felt the sound wrap around her like a hug. Her father appeared at the edge of the crowd, his phone finally lowered, his eyes on her for the first time all night. She didn't look at him. She looked at Max, who was clapping wildly, and Ethan, who was watching her with a smile that said he understood what this moment meant. She made a wish, though she wouldn't tell anyone what it was, and blew out the candles. The smoke curled upward, and Max cheered like she'd just won a race. Ethan cut the cake, handing her the first slice, and for the rest of the night, they stayed talking, laughing, eating too much frosting. The room didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like hers. The next morning, Leela woke to sunlight streaming through her bedroom window, the kind of light that felt like a fresh start. She lay still for a moment, replaying the night before, the memory of Max's laughter and Ethan's quiet kindness anchoring her. The bookmark sat on her nightstand, its colors bright against the polished wood. She reached for it, smiling at the uneven stars, and tucked it into the book she'd been reading, a small, private rebellion against her father's world of contracts and calculations. Downstairs, the house was quiet, the party's remnants cleared away by the staff. Her father was already gone, a note on the kitchen counter saying he'd flown to London for a meeting. No mention of her birthday, no apology for his absence. Leela's jaw tightened, but she didn't linger on it. She had something else to hold on to now. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "Hey, it's Ethan. Max hasn't stopped talking about the cake. He wants to know if you like art. There's a gallery thing next weekend, a low-key, no chandeliers. Want to come?" A second message followed, a photo of Max holding a half-eaten cupcake, grinning with frosting on his nose. Leela's heart lifted, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the sunlight. She typed back, "Sounds fun. Count me in." She hit send, then wheeled to the window, looking out at the city sprawling below. For the first time in years, she felt like she was part of it, not just a shadow in her father's empire, but a girl with a bookmark, a story, and two people who'd seen her when no one else had. "I notice you didn't provide a title for the story, but you've asked for a highly engaging story in 2 parts, with part 2 extended to 2,000 words, and no headings. Since you previously referenced the title CEO's paralyzed daughter sat alone at her birthday cake here until a single dad said, 'Can we join you?' I'll assume you want a continuation of that story for part 2, keeping the same characters and themes, while crafting a new part 1 to set the stage for an engaging follow-up. If you meant a different title or a new story altogether, please clarify, and I'll adjust accordingly. For now, I'll proceed with a story that builds on the original premise, focusing on Leela, Ethan, and Max, with part 1 being short and part 2 extended to 2,000 words, maintaining the emotional depth and engagement of the original. The gallery was nothing like the banquet hall from Leela's 18th birthday. No chandeliers, no silk tablecloths, just exposed brick walls and soft track lighting that bathed the paintings in a warm glow. The air smelled faintly of coffee and acrylic paint, and the crowd was a mix of art students in ripped jeans and older couples murmuring about brush strokes. Leela maneuvered her wheelchair through the narrow aisles, her eyes catching on a canvas of bold blues and yellows, abstract shapes swirling like a storm. Max bounded ahead, his sneakers squeaking on the concrete floor, pointing at every piece that caught his eye. "This one looks like a dragon," he declared, his voice echoing. Ethan followed, hands in his pockets, his smile easy but watchful. like he was ready to rein Max in if he got too loud. Leela hadn't expected to say yes to Ethan's invitation last week. After her birthday, she'd half expected the warmth of that night to fade, for Ethan and Max to vanish into the blur of her father's world, where connections rarely lasted. But the text had come, and the photo of Max with frosting on his nose had made her laugh. And something in here, maybe the part that was tired of being Alania, had typed back before she could overthink it. Now here she was, in a crowded art gallery on a Saturday afternoon, feeling more alive than she had in years. Max started back to her, holding a crumpled gallery map. "You like art, right?" he asked, his eyes wide with the certainty only a 7-year-old could muster. "Dad says you're smart, so you probably get all this stuff." Leela glanced at Ethan, who raised an eyebrow, a faint flush creeping up his neck. "Did he now?" she said, her voice teasing. Ethan shrugged, his grin sheepish. "He's not wrong," Ethan said, leaning closer to inspect a painting, though his eyes flicked to her. "You've got that look, like you see more than most people." Leela's chest tightened, not unpleasantly. She wasn't used to being seen, not like this, not by someone who didn't owe her father a favor. They moved through the gallery, Max leading the way, his chatter filling the gaps. Leela found herself talking to him about colors, about the way a painting could feel like a story without words. Ethan listened, asking questions that weren't just polite, and Max hung on her every word, like she was the coolest person he'd ever met. For the first time in a long time, Leela didn't feel like the CEO's daughter or the girl in the wheelchair. She was just Leela, 18 and curious, with a bookmark in her bag and a kid who thought she was a hero. As they reached the end of the exhibit, Max tugged at Ethan's sleeve. "Can we get hot chocolate?" he asked, then turned to Leela. "You're coming, right?" Leela hesitated, glancing at the exit, where the city waited her father's driver, her father's schedule, her father's world. But Ethan's eyes met hers, steady and warm, and she nodded. "Yeah," she said. "I'm coming." The coffee shop was a cozy hole in the wall a few blocks from the gallery, its windows fogged from the autumn chill outside. Leela wheeled herself to a corner table, the scent of roasted beans and cinnamon wrapping around her like a blanket. Max had claimed the seat next to her, already scribbling on a napkin with a crayon he'd found somewhere, narrating a story about a dragon who ate only marshmallows. Ethan returned from the counter with 3 steaming mugs of hot chocolate, each topped with a mountain of whipped cream that made Max gasp like it was Christmas morning. Leela laughed, the sound coming easier now, less like something she had to ration. She took a sip, the warmth spreading through her, and for a moment, she let herself forget the weight of her life here, the mansion that felt more like a museum, the father who was always a continent away, the accident that had rewritten her at 12. Ethan sat across from her, his hands wrapped around his mug, his eyes tracing the lines of her face when he thought she wasn't looking. She noticed, though, and it sent a flutter through her stomach, one she wasn't sure how to name. "So," he said, leaning back, "Max hasn't stopped talking about your birthday since we left. I think you've got a fan." Max nodded vigorously, not looking up from his napkin masterpiece, a smear of whipped cream on his cheek. "It was a good cake," Max said, matter of fact, like that explained everything. Leela smiled, her fingers brushing the bookmark in her bag, the one Max had made her. She'd started carrying it everywhere, a talisman against the loneliness that always seemed to creep back in. "It was more than the cake," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You guys made it our broken bar different." She didn't know how to say it without sounding fragile, so she left it there, but Ethan's eyes softened, like he heard the words she didn't say. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and for a moment, the noise of the coffee shop, the clink of mugs, the hum of conversation faded away. "Max has that effect," Ethan said, his voice low, like he was sharing a secret. "He sees people, you know, not what they do or what they have, just a broken bar them." He glanced at his son, who was now drawing a second dragon, this one with wings made of clouds. "It's why I brought him to your party. I figured he'd see you, too." Leela's throat tightened, and she looked down at her mug, the whipped cream melting into swirls. She wasn't used to these people who stayed, who saw her without pity or obligation. Her father's world was all transactions, favors traded like currency, but this felt different, real. She glanced at Max, then at Ethan, and something in her chest loosened, like a knot she'd been carrying for years was starting to unravel. They talked for hours, the conversation weaving between Max's wild stories and Ethan's quiet humor. He told her about his life here widowed 3 years ago, raising Max alone, working long hours as a logistics manager for a company that supplied parts to her father's empire. It wasn't glamorous, he said, but it paid the bills, and Max was worth every late night. Leela listened, her hands steady on her mug, and found herself telling him things she hadn't told Anania: how she used to paint before the accident, how she still dreamed of colors and canvases, how her father's absence felt like a shadow she couldn't outrun. Ethan didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty platitudes. He just listened, his eyes never leaving hers, and when she finished, he nodded, like he was filing her words somewhere safe. Max, growing restless, declared it was time for an adventure. He dragged them outside, insisting they find the best leaf pile in the park across the street. Leela hesitated. The park wasn't exactly wheelchair-friendly, with its uneven paths and scattered gravel, but Ethan didn't miss a beat. "We've got this," he said, his tone light but certain. He and Max flanked her, Ethan pushing her chair when the ground got rough, Max scouting ahead like a tiny explorer. They found a pile of crimson and gold leaves under an oak tree, and Max dove in, tossing handfuls into the air. Leela laughed, her breath visible in the crisp air, and when Max tossed a leaf her way, she caught it, twirling it between her fingers. Ethan knelt beside her, his shoulder brushing hers, and for a moment, they watched Max together, the world quiet except for the rustle of leaves and his giddy laughter. "You're good with him," Leela said, glancing at Ethan. "He's lucky to have you." Ethan's smile was small, almost sad. "I try. It's not always easy, you know, being enough." He paused, his eyes on Max, who was now attempting to build a leaf fort. "But he makes it worth it. And days like these are broken bar they help." Leela nodded, understanding more than she could say. She'd spent years trying to be enough for her father, for the world he'd built around her, but it was never enough. Sitting here, with leaves in her hair and Ethan's quiet presence beside her, she felt like maybe she didn't have to try so hard. Maybe she was enough, just as she was. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in pinks and oranges, and Max ran back, his cheeks flushed, a leaf stuck to his jacket. "Leela, you gotta come back to our house," he said, his eyes bright. "We have a backyard, and I can show you my rocket ship." Leela raised an eyebrow, glancing at Ethan, who chuckled. "It's a cardboard box with stickers," he clarified, but in his mind, "it's headed to Mars." Leela laughed, and Max grabbed her hand, tugging like he could will her to follow. "I don't know," she said, her voice playful but hesitant. "I might have to check with my driver. My dad's kinda far broken bar strict about schedules." The words felt heavy, a reminder of the world waiting to pull her back. But Ethan shook his head, his expression gentle but firm. "Tell him you're busy," he said. "You're allowed to have a life, Leela." The words hit harder than she expected, a quiet challenge to the cage she'd lived in for years. She pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen, then typed a quick message to her driver, "Staying out. I'll call when I'm ready." Her heart raced as she hit send, a small act of rebellion that felt like a leap. They took Ethan's beat-up minivan to his house, a small craftsman-style home on the edge of the city, its paint peeling but its windows warm with light. Max led her through the front door, chattering about his rocket ship, while Ethan carried her wheelchair up the steps, his movements careful but unhurried. Inside, the house was cluttered but cozy, with mismatched furniture, books stacked on every surface, and a faint smell of burnt toast. Max dragged her to the backyard, where the rocket ship sat to a cardboard box covered in star stickers, its door flap hanging crooked. "You're the astronaut," Max declared, handing her a plastic helmet that was too big for her head. Leela laughed, slipping it on, and let him guide her through a pretend launch to the moon. Ethan watched from the porch, a mug of coffee in his hand, his smile soft but steady. When Max ran inside to grab more space supplies, Ethan sat on the steps, close enough that Leela could feel the warmth of him in the cool evening air. "You're good with him, too," he said, echoing her earlier words. "He doesn't trust people easily, but with your broken bar it's like he's known you forever." Leela looked down at the helmet in her lap, her fingers tracing its cracked edge. "I don't know why," she said, her voice quiet. "I'm not a broken bar. I don't feel like someone people trust." "Not usually." Ethan tilted his head, his eyes searching hers. "Maybe because you're real," he said simply. "You don't pretend to be something you're not." "That's rare, Leela, especially in your world." She wanted to argue, to say her world wasn't hers, that she was just trapped in it, but the words didn't come. Instead, she looked at him, at the lines around his eyes, the calluses on his hands, the way he carried his life without complaint. "Your world's not so bad," she said finally, a smile tugging at her lips. He laughed, a low, warm sound, and for a moment, they sat there, the night settling around them, Max's laughter echoing from inside. When it was time to go, Ethan drove her home, Max asleep in the back seat, clutching a stuffed astronaut. Leela's mansion loomed ahead, its lights cold and precise, but she didn't feel the usual dread. She felt full, like the day had poured something into her she hadn't known she was missing. Ethan walked her to the door, his hand brushing hers as he handed her the bookmark she'd left in the van. "See you again?" he asked, his voice quiet but hopeful. "Yeah," Leela said, her heart steady. "Definitely." As she wheeled inside, the bookmark in her hand, she knew she'd carry this day with her, a small, bright thing to hold on to when the shadows came back. To proceed, I'll treat this as a continuation of the story about Leela, Ethan, and Max, using the same title, and create a new two-part story. Part 1 will be short, setting up a new chapter in their lives, and Part 2 will be extended to 2,000 words, delivering a highly engaging narrative that builds on their relationship and Leela's journey. If you meant a different title or structure, for example, a 3-part story or a new story entirely, please provide the title or clarify, and I'll tailor the response accordingly. For now, I'll craft a story that advances the emotional arc of Leela, Ethan, and Max, maintaining the tone and themes of the previous parts. Winter had settled over the city, dusting the streets with snow and turning the air sharp. Leela sat by the window of her father's mansion, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the world outside soften under a blanket of white. The bookmark Max had given her was tucked into the novel on her lap, its painted stars worn from her fingers brushing over them. 3 months had passed since the art gallery, since hot chocolate and leaf piles, since Ethan and Max had become a quiet, steady presence in her life. They texted often, Max sending blurry photos of his rocket ship or drawings of dragons, Ethan checking in with a warmth that made her heart skip. They'd met up a few times since, small outings to parks or diners, each one chipping away at the walls Leela had built around herself. Tonight, though, was different. Ethan had invited her to their house for a holiday party, just a handful of friends and neighbors. Nothing like her father's sterile galas. She'd said yes, but now, staring at the snow, she felt a flicker of doubt. Her father was in Shanghai, as usual, but his rules lingered, schedules, appearances, the expectation that she'd stay in his orbit. Going to Ethan's felt like stepping out of it entirely. Her phone buzzed, a message from Max. "Leela, you coming? I made cookies. They're kinda burned but Dad says they're still good." A photo followed, Max grinning with flour on his nose, holding a tray of lumpy cookies. Leela smiled, the doubt easing. She texted back, "On my way. Save me a cookie." She called her driver, ignoring the tightness in her chest, and wheeled to her closet, choosing a red sweater that felt festive but not forced. As she slipped on her coat, the bookmark fell from her book, and she picked it up, tucking it into her pocket. It was her anchor, a reminder of the night she'd stopped feeling invisible. The drive to Ethan's house was quiet, the city lights blurred by snow. When she arrived, Max was waiting at the door, bouncing in a Santa hat too big for his head. "Leela!" he shouted, nearly tripping over his own feet to hug her. Ethan appeared behind him, his sweater sleeves rolled up, a dish towel slung over his shoulder. His smile was warm, but there was a nervousness in his eyes, like he wasn't sure she'd actually show. "Glad you made it," he said, holding the door as she wheeled inside. The house was alive with light and noisy music spilling from a speaker, voices laughing, the smell of pine and cinnamon filling the air. It was messy, real, nothing like the polished emptiness of her father's world. Max grabbed her hand, pulling her toward a table piled with food and cookies, a lopsided gingerbread house, bowls of chips and dip. "You gotta try my cookies," he said, thrusting one at her. Leela took a bite, the charred edge crunching, and grinned. "Not bad, chef," she said, and Max beamed, racing off to show someone else his creation. Ethan lingered, leaning against the table, watching her with that quiet intensity she was starting to recognize. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low enough to blend with the music. Leela nodded, but her fingers tightened around the cookie, crumbs falling to her lap. She wasn't used to these people, warmth, a place where she didn't have to perform. Ethan seemed to sense it, because he didn't push, just handed her a mug of cider and sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. The holiday party spilled into every corner of Ethan's small house, a chaotic symphony of laughter, clinking glasses, and Max's relentless energy. Leela found herself at the center of it, not as the CEO's daughter or the girl in the wheelchair, but as herself, a Leela, who laughed at Max's terrible cookie recipe, who argued with Ethan's neighbor about the best Christmas movie, who felt the room's warmth seep into her bones. The living room was crowded, a mismatched group of people sprawled on couches or leaning against walls, some with kids chasing Max around a wobbly Christmas tree strung with popcorn and tinsel. Leela watched it all, her hands resting lightly on her wheels, her heart fuller than it had been in years. She'd spent so many holidays alone in her father's mansion, the silence broken only by the hum of his staff or the occasional call from his assistant. This was different. This was alive. Ethan stayed close, not hovering but present, refilling her cider or nudging Max to stop stealing ornaments off the tree. He introduced her to his friends, a mechanic named Sarah who told bad puns, a teacher named JV who debated art with her like she was an expert, a nurse named Kim who asked about her favorite books. They didn't tiptoe around her wheelchair or her father's name, and Leela realized, with a jolt, that Ethan must have told them about her not as a tragedy, but as someone worth knowing. The thought made her chest ache, a good ache, like stretching a muscle that hadn't moved in years. As the night wore on, Max dragged her to the tree, insisting she help decorate. "You pick the star," he said, holding up a glittery, slightly dented star made of cardboard. Leela laughed, taking it, her fingers brushing the rough edges. Ethan lifted Max so he could reach the top, and Leela handed him the star, their hands meeting in the air. Max wobbled, giggling, and Ethan steadied him, his eyes catching Leela's over Max's shoulder. For a moment, the room faded, and it was just Thema, Ethan's quiet strength, Max's infectious joy, Leela's growing certainty that she belonged here. After the star was placed, Max declared it was time for games. He roped everyone into a round of charades, and Leela found herself laughing until her sides hurt as Sarah tried to mime reindeer with exaggerated antlers. When it was Leela's turn, she hesitated, her hands gripping her wheels. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, not like this, not for fun. But Max cheered her on, and Ethan leaned close, whispering, "You've got this. Just go wild." She did, mimicking a snowman with dramatic flair, and when the room erupted in guesses and laughter, she felt a rush of freedom, like she was spinning on the dance floor again. The game ended with Max sprawled on the couch, half asleep, a cookie crumb stuck to his cheek. Ethan carried him to bed, and the party quieted, guests drifting to the kitchen or bundling up to head home. Leela stayed by the tree, its lights casting soft patterns on her face. Ethan returned, his hair mussed from wrestling Max into pajamas, and sat beside her, closer now, his knee brushing her wheel. "He's out like a light," he said, his voice low, warm. Thanks for humoring him. He's been planning this night for weeks. Leela smiled, her fingers tracing the bookmark in her pocket. He's not the only one who had fun, she said. There's a broken bar. It's not like anything I'm used to. She glanced at the tree, then at him. My dad's parties are all about who's who, what they can get from each other. This feels a broken bar real. Ethan nodded, his eyes steady on hers. That's what I like about it. No one's here to impress anyone, just to be together. He paused, his fingers tapping his knee, like he was working up to something. I'm glad you're here, Leela. Really glad. Her heart stuttered, and she looked down, suddenly aware of how close they were, how his voice seemed to wrap around her. Me too, she said, barely above a whisper. She wanted to say more, how his house felt like a home, how Max's laughter made her feel lighter, how Ethan's presence made her want to be braver, but the words caught, too big for the moment. They sat in silence for a while, the tree lights flickering, the last guests saying goodbyes in the hall. Leela's phone buzzed, her driver's name flashing, and she sighed, the real world creeping back. I should go, she said, though every part of her wanted to stay. Ethan nodded, but his hand brushed hers as he stood, a touch so light it could have been an accident, but wasn't. I'll walk you out, he said. He helped her with her coat, his fingers careful but sure, and they moved to the porch, where snow fell in soft, silent flakes. The driver's car idled at the curb, its headlights cutting through the dark. Leela paused, looking up at Ethan, his face half lit by the porch light, his breath visible in the cold. Ethan, she started, her voice steady despite the nerves twisting in her stomach. This meant a lot more than you know. She hesitated, then reached into her pocket, pulling out the bookmark. I keep this with me, always. It's our broken bar. It reminds me I'm not invisible. Ethan's eyes softened, and he knelt so they were level, his hand resting on the arm of her chair. You're not invisible, Leela. Not to us. He glanced back at the house, where Max slept, then at her. Your family now, if you want to be. The words hit like a wave, warm and overwhelming. Leela nodded, her throat tight, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to hide. I want that, she said, her voice breaking just a little. Ethan smiled, and for a moment, she thought he might say more, but he just squeezed her hand, his touch grounding her. As she wheeled to the car, the snow falling around her, Leela felt something new, a spark of courage, a sense of belonging she'd never known. She looked back at Ethan, standing on the porch, and knew this was just the beginning. The mansion waited, her father's world waited, but so did Ethan and Max, and for the first time, she felt ready to choose her own path.